Gracious God, may only your word be spoken and your word received. Amen.
Amen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
When I was in seminary, I heard this story that has stuck with me for 15, 16 years now. And I heard it from another classmate who had learned this story from their seminarian supervisor at their internship site. The story went like this, that the supervisor, when they were a new rector in that congregation, brand new rector on their first day, they were in the middle of celebrating liturgy, celebrating Eucharist for the first time in the congregation. And after they had finished distributing communion, they turned around and discovered that the altar guild had come out on the altar to clear away all of the elements from communion before the post-communion prayer even happened, like before the end of the service. And the new rector was like, what is happening here? What is going on? And so coming from a posture of curiosity, knowing that every congregation has its little quirks, its little things that it does a little differently, sometimes the architecture sort of forces you to do some things differently. So the rector comes from this place of curiosity and says to the altar guild members after the service, I've never seen that before. Tell me why we do it this way here. And the altar guild members, blessings be upon all altar guild members, you do so much. The altar guild members said, I don't know, this is just how we do it here. And the rector's like, okay. And so for the next several weeks and months, they ask every altar guild member they have as this practice continues, do you know, I'm a little curious, never seen this before. Do you know why we do it this way here? And the altar guild members would say, I don't know, this is just how I was trained to do it here. It's how we've always done it here. Okay. So finally, somebody suggests that maybe the rector might want to have a conversation with a grande dame, an elder stateslady of the congregation who had been an altar guild chair decades before. Maybe this mater familias would know something about why we do it this way in this congregation. And ends up finding out that the story is that 5 rectors prior, the rector had a drinking problem and would overserve the chalices, which we are explicitly instructed not to do, to be clear, but would overserve the chalices and then consume them all at the end of the service, which is some clergy's piety in some places. I don't know if you know this, we have a special sink here at Holy Cross called a piscina, and you take the leftover wine and it goes into a pipe directly into the ground instead of into the sewer. That's generally what we do here at Holy Cross, but in some places, the clergy or the altar party finish the chalices, and the wine, communion wine, is fortified port. It's extra alcoholic. And so the rector would consume all of the wine and then would go to coffee hour and say inappropriate things to people. And so the altar guild sort of like took it upon themselves to start clearing the credence table before the rector had an opportunity to do this. And then that practice just kept getting taught to the next person and the next person and the next person. And now you had these altar guild members decades later who had no idea that this was why they were doing this. And that, that rector 5 rectors ago, they loved him. And all of us have the things that we struggle with, right? And so they were just trying to find a way to work around it in the system. But they didn't know the history. They didn't know the story of why it was that they were doing what they were doing. And when you don't know your history, you can end up doing all kinds of things that you don't really understand why it is that you're doing them. In Genesis this morning, in our Genesis reading for today, it starts out with this line that feels like it's a throwaway line. Now, a new king arose in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And it just sounds like this line of transition that you sort of like, okay, yeah, and now we're moving on with the story. But actually, this is a critical verse, a critical sentence in understanding the whole narrative arc of the Bible. I think I wasn't in seminary until I understood that these stories that I knew, this story that I knew about the Israelites escaping Egypt, and this other story that I knew about Joseph and his special coat and his brothers throwing him in a well, and then he ends up with the Pharaoh and all of these things. He has these dreams. He saves the people of Egypt. I didn't totally understand that the reading we heard last week, where Joseph invites his brothers to come and live with him in Egypt, that is how the people of Israel end up in Egypt in the first place at the beginning of the Exodus story. But we're told that a new king arose who did not know Joseph. A new king arose who did not know his history, about how it was that these people of Israel got to be in Egypt in the first place. And I think that one of the things that happens when we don't know our history is that it provokes sort of an unnamed sense of anxiety within us. When you're not really sure how you got where you are, there's an underlying anxiety about what am I doing here and why. And some people respond to anxiety and they get timid, right? Other people respond to anxiety and they get mean and they get cruel. And that's what happens with Pharaoh in our story for this morning. Pharaoh sees these people. He doesn't understand how they got there. He says, I'm afraid that they're going to get strong. These people seem strong. What could happen if these strong people were to have an uprising and overtake us? So I will oppress them with cruel labor. That's what Pharaoh says that he's going to do to keep these outsider people down, to keep them oppressed. And what Pharaoh doesn't know, because he doesn't know his history about Joseph, is that Joseph's God is not a God to be messed with. If he had known this story about Joseph and about how Joseph's God inspired Joseph with these dreams that saved the people of Egypt from famine, how might he have behaved differently in that moment if he knew his history? But he didn't. And then the thing that he fears the most, these people of Israel rising up and liberating themselves, that is exactly what happened. Because he didn't know his history. And he didn't see where it was that this could go and what it was that this God could do. And the contrast to that is our gospel story for this morning is Peter in the gospel story who does know his history. Jesus says to his disciples, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And the crowds say, maybe John the Baptist, or maybe he's Elijah, maybe he's Jeremiah, maybe he's these prophets reincarnated. But Peter knows his history. He knows his recent history in that John the Baptist, who just died a couple of chapters before this in Matthew's gospel, he knows the story of John the Baptist and what it was that John the Baptist prophesied. And he knows the story of Jeremiah and what it was that Jeremiah prophesied during the time of the exile, the people of Israel's exile in Babylon. And he knows the story of Elijah and what it was that Elijah was preaching during the time of the Israelite kings. Peter knows his history. And therefore, he's able to say, Jesus is not just another one of these prophets. Jesus is the one the prophets were foretelling. Who do you say that I am? You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Peter knows his history. And that means that he is able to recognize the patterns and articulate the truth of what is coming next. It means that he is able to trust. He knows his history, he knows the pattern, so he can trust what it is that he is seeing and hearing from Jesus to be able to identify who it is that Jesus really was and who it is that Jesus really is. And that idea of trust brings me back to that congregation that I was speaking about at the beginning. Because part of what was happening was that this altar guild member decades later and this clergy person who never participated in some of the activities that earlier clergy person had, suddenly the two of them are acting out anxieties and parts that aren't actually part of their lived experience, right? They're acting out this behavior that says, as it turns out, we can't trust the clergy with the elements of communion. And if you can't trust the clergy with that, now you're really up the creek, right? Crystal preached this brilliant sermon a couple of weeks ago about the family of Jacob and pointed out that Jacob is also acting out behaviors that his father Isaac and his relatives before that acted out, behaviors that Jacob himself had felt like he was a victim of, and yet somehow he's still perpetrating on the next generation. These pieces about knowing our history and trying to get behind family secrets and family behaviors, all of that happens both at the familial level and at the systems level of a congregation and at a national level, like the Egyptians, where one person doesn't bother to know his history and it ends catastrophically for all of them. So this week, what I found myself thinking about was how it is that we can be like Peter. How it is that we can learn our history so we don't end up shadowboxing ghosts of the past, but rather learn our history so we can identify the patterns, we can interpret the prophecies, we can be a people who are able to step into the future because we know our past. Step into a future full of hope and full of promise. I pray that that may be so. Amen.